Hello, in this video I will go over the contribution process for the Cadence Cookbook and showcase an example of how a new recipe could be added to the cookbook as a GitHub submodule. For some background context, the Cadence Cookbook is a collection of code examples and use cases of the Cadence programming language on the Flow blockchain. And each recipe is added to the cookbook as a GitHub submodule, so it is an independent repository that contains code and explanations of a contract example, transaction example, and test cases supporting both the contract and transaction code. And one can contribute new recipes to the cookbook by creating their own GitHub repository of the proper format, which we'll go over in the later portion of this video, and creating a pull request to this main Cadence Cookbook recipe. And once approved, your recipe will go live on the cookbook website. Each cookbook recipe repository is divided into two key components. The Cadence code files, which sit under the Cadence folder, and the explanations files, which sit under the explanations folder in the repository. The name of the recipe is corresponding to the name of the GitHub repository that is imported as a submodule, and that will be the slug for that recipe once it's added to the cookbook. Within the Cadence folder, we store Cadence files containing the contract example, transaction example, and test cases example code for that recipe. And under the explanations folder, we store the corresponding text files that have explanations regarding the contract code, transaction code, and test code. We do require that both contract code and transaction code are present for each recipe. However, the test code is currently optional, although highly recommended that you provide with every new recipe added to the cookbook. Additionally, an important file is the index.js file in the recipe repo, which is the root file that stores some recipe metadata, which we will look into a bit later in this video. For the recipes, we support a series of fields which may be updated in the future, and this document will be updated accordingly in that case. But these fields indicate the mandatory and optional fields for each recipe. As mentioned, the recipe slug and the name of the GitHub repository for that recipe constitutes the unique identifier of that recipe. And it's how it will be referred to throughout the cookbook and the URL of that recipe. Then the title field indicates the title of the recipe. Featured text is an optional field indicating a subheading for the recipe title. A cover URL is a URL pointing to the path of a featured cover image for that recipe. If not provided, we'll default to a Flow cover image. The created at date is the date that the recipe was added to the cookbook. The author is how the contributor would like to be referred to in the recipe. A playground link is a link to the Flow playground containing the deployed recipe code, which we highly advise including with each recipe. An excerpt, which is a brief description of the recipe contents. And then, as I discussed earlier, code examples and explanation text for both the contract code, transaction code, and test cases code and explanation. These are passed as paths to the location of the code example and transaction example and test cases examples. And usually they are just named as follows: contract.cdc, transaction.cdc, test.cdc, and contract.txt, transaction.txt, and test.txt. The last field is the filters object, which allows us to filter recipes along different criteria. Currently, we only support the difficulty parameter, which you can specify as either beginner, intermediate, or advanced for that recipe. And here we have an example index.js file for a recipe repository, which we'll look at in a minute in an example repo. And this recipe index.js file is the same format across all recipes, and it just passes in those fields that I mentioned earlier. For example, recipe slug, titled, featured text, created at, author, playground link, and so on. And we just ask that you provide these fields when you are creating your contribution PR. once you have created your recipe pull request and submitted it for approval and it gets merged into the cookbook, you will see a reference pointer to your recipe added here, which is a GitHub submodule. And this points to a commit, an approved commit in your recipe repo that was merged into the cookbook. And here you can see an example recipe that has been added. Also, as part of your pull request, we ask that in the recipes.js file, you import your recipe once the GitHub submodule has been added and assign it to one of several predefined modules which act as groupings for recipes. These are in chronological order, so we recommend adding a recipe in the point where you think it best fits in the cookbook, meaning the best parent module for it and positioning in the queue of other recipes already in the cookbook. If you think that your recipe doesn't fall under any of these existing modules, then we suggest that you can create a new module and add your recipe to it, and we will review that as part of the pull request to add that recipe and create that new module in the cookbook. Now let's have a look at an example recipe repo and see what corresponding components are added to this repo to make it a complete recipe for the cookbook. As you can see, first we have the index.js file for this recipe, which is currently owned by the Flow blockchain, but we anticipate that going forward recipes will be contributed by open source and members of the community as well. And so in this index.js file, we have the repo name passed as the slug for that recipe. This is just for ease of record keeping so that our GitHub submodules and names of recipes are matching. Then we ask that you pass the path of the contract, transaction, and test cases. And generally, these are standardized as the code all sits under the Cadence folder and explanation files all sit under the explanations folder. And here we pass in the required fields for recipes, which we went over earlier in the video. And if you have any questions regarding these fields, you can always find them in the contribution markdown file in the parent cookbook repo. And here we specify again the slug, the title, the creation date, the author of this recipe, a playground link, an excerpt, and then the paths to code and explanations. And lastly, filters. And currently we only support the difficulty filter. And inside of the Cadence and explanations folders, you can see some example Cadence files that have been incorporated in existing recipes. And this is an example transaction file and corresponding text files for the contract explanation and text explanations. We do ask that you ensure that your Cadence code does compile and that all test cases you write with that code are passing, because the criteria of merging a recipe into the parent Cadence cookbook repository is that all tests must be passing both on the front end as well as all Cadence tests in all recipes in the cookbook. This is to ensure that developers and new learners of Cadence and learners of the Flow blockchain will be able to quickly make a jump start off of your recipe repository as a learning point and not face any issues running the code when they start to interact with the Cadence files directly. And once you create a pull request into the parent repository, you will see if the test cases are passing or failing, as they trigger automatically when a pull request is initiated. Thank you for watching, and we look forward to seeing your new recipes in the Cadence Cookbook.